If you'll bring the jury, please.
Yes, sir. Please be seated.
Time-wise, how are we doing? We're at 4:30. Do you have other witnesses today as well?
Yes, sir. That's, if the court wants, we have one more witness, an expert witness in the use of force.
All right, and it's now 4:30. How much longer do you have on direct with this witness?
You know, I always underestimate, Judge, but I'd say 10 to 15 minutes.
All right. Well, I guess we'll see how it goes.
We can do tomorrow or not?
I'd like to move today, but tomorrow.
We don't like to do things.
I mean, we're scheduled to leave at noon tomorrow, and you have someone else, don't you? So, other witnesses. Thank you. You may proceed, sir.
So, when we left, we were talking about April 4th and the actions of Officer Slager, and we had talked about the training that he and others received at the Criminal Justice Academy on use of force, and also that the North Charleston Police Department trains people on use of force as well. I want to show you what's been marked, Appendix 82 and 83. I think you've previously seen them. And are those the use of force training plans from both the Criminal Justice Academy and the North Charleston Police Department?
This is a CJA, which is the Criminal Justice Academy lesson plan cover sheet for a basic law enforcement use of force. And this is a policy of use of force for the North Charleston Police Department.
In effect on April 4th of 2015.
Yes, sir, I believe the date. Yes, sir.
Your Honor, we offer these as defendants 83 and 84.
Your Honor, object to the CJA, I don't believe the foundation has been laid for this witness's independent knowledge of the CJA lesson plan.
All right, response?
Are you familiar with the Criminal Justice Academy that trains all police officers in the state of South Carolina?
I am familiar with the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy.
And does the Criminal Justice Academy have to approve both the lesson plan and the trainers at the North Charleston Police Department on all issues trained by North Charleston Police Department?
Yes, sir.
No objection to the North Charleston training plan. My only objection is what's going on in the market.
It's rather disingenuous that the Criminal Justice Academy, who has to approve North Charleston's training, would not be training the same thing on use of force.
If they call a witness to say that, that's great. They said no witness to do that. I object.
All right. The objection is sustained.
In the training, North Charleston Police Department training manual, have you ever been challenged by the Criminal Justice Academy that the training that you provide is not in accordance with their lesson plans?
Not to my knowledge.
And in that training in North Charleston, do you train officers on the continuum use of force?
By policy, yes, sir, we do.
And do you also train them how to observe people that they're detaining in terms of the level of use of force that is appropriate?
If you're talking about observing a person's actions,
Yes.
yes, sir.
And does that include training? And I refer you to page 8 of the North Charleston lesson plan regarding use of force, people who are under the influence of cocaine.
I don't have that document. And your question again was?
Does the training approved by the Criminal Justice Academy, given by approved trainers in North Charleston, include observations of detainees who may be under the influence of cocaine?
If you're referring to this section that is marked under 02, 3, it says, medical attention will be sought for a subject whenever multiple activations coupled with symptoms of excited delirium or drug psychosis are suspected as defined by training.
And do you understand what excited delirium would be? Is there training on what excited delirium is?
I'm sure there is, but I'm not familiar with the exact terminology of it.
Would you recognize that excited delirium is intense?
Objection, Your Honor. The witness just testified he wasn't familiar.
Could I refresh your memory on excited delirium by showing you the solicitor's document that defines it? And that has Ms. Wilson's initials on the bottom?
It has R5 SAW 1659 on the bottom.
The objection sustained as to this line of questioning based on the court's prior rulings in this case.
Without the definition of excited delirium, is that word used in that phrase used in the training of officers at North Charleston Police Department?
It is in this document.
Is that document a lesson plan?
No, sir, this is a policy.
Is that an official documentation that all police officers in North Charleston must obey and act in conformance with that policy?
For medical attention, yes, sir. The specific one.
And how to use force, isn't that the policy of use of force?
Yes, sir.
And among other policies, there are policies at North Charleston for police chases. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Is there a policy for the foot chase?
I do not recall specifically.
As the chief of police today or on April 4, 2015, was there a foot policy, foot chase policy? And you may refer back to the index of all the policies and procedures at North Charleston.
took that one back. No, here it is, Council, thank you.
Are there foot chases in North Charleston?
Yes, sir.
Do they happen on a regular occasion?
Yes, sir.
Do you know whether or not Officer Slager's involved in previous foot chases?
I would assume he had been, yes, sir.
And you still are a member of the National Association of Chiefs of Police?
Yes, sir.
You recognize Defendant's Exhibit number 8.
I do not recognize it.
Can you tell me what the document is?
It says,
Objection, Your Honor.
Objection is sustained.
Is this a document that's issued to members of the National Association of Chiefs of Police?
Objection reading.
He said he doesn't recognize the document.
Does the National Association of Chiefs of Police send out documents to their members on a regular basis?
yes, sir.
And do you receive those documents?
Yes, sir.
And did you receive a document for officer safety chief's checklist?
I do not recall that document.
Do you try to employ the suggestions of the International Association of Chiefs of Police in terms of implementing policies?
We use CALIA standards in order to implement policies. Some of the best practices, there are some best practices in the IACP that are utilized as well.
And one would be wearing body armor,
Yes, sir.
using a seatbelt,
Yes, sir, absolutely.
and implementing a foot pursuit policy.
I don't recall that.
And you don't recall whether or not the North Charleston Police Department has a policy for foot chases?
I do not specifically for foot chases.
Kindly answer any questions the prosecutor may have.
Thank you.
Out of state.
Thank you, Your Honor. Any questions over this? Chief Driggers, Mr. Savage asked you several questions about car stops, and isn't it true when conducting a traffic stop and approaching a driver, when you obtain the driver's license, you're supposed to look at it, and check out the person to make sure the license, to the best that you can, fits the person driving the car?
Yes, ma'am, that'd be reasonable.
And if that's done, then the officer involved would know that whoever he called in on that license would be the right person who was driving the car.
Yes, ma'am.
And that's one of the reasons you want to do that, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And Mr. Savage also asked you about active shooter training, and you testified that the whole department had been through it.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 257. And ask you if you recognize that document.
Is a document training and officers who attended.
And is that a document that is kept in the normal course of business at the North Charleston Police Department?
Yes, ma'am.
And are those the training records for Michael Slager?
It does indicate Officer Michael Slager.
And it also indicates he attended the active shooter training that you discussed. If you look at the top of the page, very first line,
Yes, ma'am.
and that was in 2013. Is that right?
12/7/2013.
And in that active shooter training, that's a shoot, don't shoot type scenario, right?
Yes, ma'am. Pretty
It's
much.
not just standing at the range and looking at a target.
No, ma'am.
Okay. But when you do go to the range and do the yearly training that's required by the department, one of the things that y'all are taught constantly is to reassess. Is
Yes,
that
ma'am.
correct? And one of the things that you train in your department is de-escalation,
Yes, ma'am.
because you deal with all types of people, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You deal with people strung out on drugs, right? You deal with people who are mentally ill, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You deal with young people who are just foolish, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you train reassessment and de-escalation in dealing with those kinds of folks.
Yes, ma'am, to the best of our ability.
And you talked about Mr. Slager's history. I'm going to show you what's been marked State's Exhibit 256. Show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 256, and ask you, this is also a collection of documents kept in the normal course of business at North Charleston Police Department.
Yes, ma'am, this is an internal investigation.
And in this stack, I believe you would have seen this document and initialed it regarding a complaint against Mr. Slager,
Yes, ma'am,
and those are your initials there?
that it is.
Okay. And so when you testified earlier that there had never been any sustained issues with Mr. Slager, did you just forget that one?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And this involved a situation where Mr. Slager, not that he misused force or anything like that, but he responded to a situation between two people, and they wanted him to write a report, and he refused, and that's against your policy. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
If you're asked.
Excuse me?
If you're asked to write a report, you should write one.
And that's something that he was actually sanctioned for by you and his superiors for not writing a report when requested. Correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And that was in January of 2015, correct?
The date,
See this, okay?
yes, the incident date would have been in 15.
Your Honor, we offer states 256.
Madam Solicitor, I saw where I concurred with the findings, but I did not look at the findings, so I did not.
Says the defense. Submitted without objection.
And you testified on cross-examination, Chief, regarding the absenteeism in that district on that day and other days. Regarding absenteeism, and those reports that we've seen a number of times,
Yes, ma'am.
it's not a secret, is it? When people are gonna be off work.
No, ma'am.
And it is up to the sergeants in each of those regions to figure out if that's a peak crime time or a problem time, and whether or not it's going to be an issue or should be an issue if they're shorthanded. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
And you rely on them to decide that?
Absolutely.
Because how many different bureaus are there altogether?
There are 5 right now.
And so you have a sergeant over each one of those
Well,
making those decisions?
No, there would be, there are sergeants over each day shift and squads 1 and 2, central day, central evening, central night, and then the same thing in the south and the same thing in the north.
And we've heard a lot about this Charleston Farms area. That is a high crime area.
Yes,
correct?
ma'am, it is.
But even in high crime areas, there are peak times and not peak times.
Yes,
correct?
ma'am.
Crime can happen anytime though, right?
Yes, ma'am.
But in an area like that, you would agree that it's not a good idea to leave your patrol car unlocked and unsupervised. That's not a good idea.
Yes, ma'am.
And it
That's
wouldn't
not a
be a
good
good
idea.
idea to leave it unlocked and unsupervised with an unknown person parked just yards away from it, correct?
Yes, ma'am, I'd agree with that.
And in doing the policing of Charleston Farms or anywhere else, you would expect your officers to use good decision-making skills and their own discretion before making decisions about who to stop and who to pursue. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And if you are 105 pounds, that might affect your discretion and your decision-making, correct?
Yes, ma'am, could.
About what you get yourself into, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Especially if you thought you might be shorthanded that day. Isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you would agree, would you not, that C.J. Haversham's response to Officer Slager in 2.5 minutes is not a bad response time at all, is it?
No, ma'am. That's a pretty good response time.
And pretty good compared to what?
Our e-calls probably range in 4.5 minutes, 4.5 minutes, something like that. Emergency calls for service.
Now, you were also questioned about your use of force policy, which I believe was introduced into evidence. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And that policy is something that is actually issued to each officer, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
They sign for it after they go through training,
Yes, ma'am, they do.
every year. And your policy reads, does it not, that an officer may use deadly force only when the officer reasonably believes that the action is in defense of human life, including his own life, or in defense of any person in imminent danger of serious physical injury. Isn't that correct?
And I would assume you're reading that from the policy, so that, yes, sir, yes, ma'am.
Reasonableness is key, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Imminent danger is key, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Serious physical injury is key, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Did you give the court report of the exhibits you had introduced?
Here they are here.
No, sir, I'm sorry. 656. And 257.
Can you read that right?
Yes. Chief, with respect to the active shooter training, who is the training officer for that?
For me, it would have, there were several of them.
For Officer Slager.
I'm not sure who trained Officer Slager during that time.
And that was a one-day course?
Yes, sir, I believe it was a pretty substantial amount of time.
One day,
I think so.
years ago.
15, I think this date was.
And so that training officer would still be available to testify?
Yes, sir.
And they could give the best description of what active shooter training is?
Yes, sir.
And you're not familiar with the uniforming worn at that time or what the circumstances of that is?
Say that again, sir, I didn't.
You're not familiar with the procedure, the process that's used in that training scenario?
No, sir, I went through it, but I was a participant in it.
And of course, when was that you were involved
It would have been probably in 15.
in? In 2015?
Yes, sir.
Now, with respect to the sanction for what the solicitor said Mr. Slager got in trouble for, is this the only occasion he was in trouble?
And as I testified, I didn't know about that one, or if I forgot about that one as well, but
Well, with reference to State's Exhibit 256, was there an explanation of the failure to write the report?
I'd have to look at that to see. What was the disciplinary action? Y'all already jumbled up the pages. Give me just a second. Yeah, apparently this is an explanation of some type here written by.
And so the explanation for the jury would be that these are two neighbors that have been fighting and called the police out to their apartment over 20 times.
It does say that the police had responded 20 times.
So this would have been the 21st report.
Well, it says it just told both parties to grow up and start acting like adults and leave each other alone. And then he says, I spoke to the dispatch who stated this I would imagine this is an ongoing issue police have responded to for 20 more than 20 times.
So it's the 21st report that Officer Slager was, actually he wasn't sanctioned, he got a letter saying, next time write a report.
Yeah, and I can't find that piece of paper here. Letter of instruction is what he received, and that is the first step, and it's not a form of discipline.
No lost time, no lost pay, nothing.
No, sir.
And that's the only thing in this record.
Again, that I'm aware of here.
The training records that you testified to the prosecutor about, have you looked over all of Officer Slater's training records?
I have not.
Well, then how did you know about the active shooter training?
It's on the front top line there.
Take the time and tell us where Officer Slater has ever received de-escalation training. He received training about taxi cab licenses, right?
I haven't gotten that one yet. He received crisis intervention training from NAMI. It does not say that he has specifically received de-escalation training.
That was the best guess that you could make as to his training history.
Sir?
In response to the prosecutor's question, that was the best estimate that you made.
As far as without reviewing the document, it does not specifically say that he has de-escalation training.
Thank you, sir.
Regarding the, what did you say, it's a letter, some kind of,
Le-
it's a letter called in 256?
Letter of instruction.
This was not a big deal, was it?
No, ma'am.
This was just a situation where after 20 times, Officer Slager was frustrated and didn't want to do a report. Right?
Objection to the mindset of Officer Slater.
The objection sustained.
After 20 times of someone going out to these people's house, Officer Slager on the 21st time chose not to write a report, correct?
It appears that, yes, ma'am.
And that's against your policy, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Because that protects your department and it protects your officers to do a report and document what has happened, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And that doesn't mean that he murdered somebody, he just didn't follow the rules this time, correct?
That's right.
It's hard to be a police officer, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am, it
It's
is.
frustrating to be a police officer.
Yes, ma'am.
It is thankless to be a police officer.
Yes, ma'am.
And one of the reasons that you do so much training is so that frustrations don't get the better of you. Isn't that true?
Yes, ma'am, we do our best.
And you do active shooter training to help officers learn different stressful situations, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you do firearms training, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And you do defensive tactics training, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And better, so that everybody is safe, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Not just the suspect who's acting a fool, but the officer. Keeping them safe is the goal, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's why you count on people who weigh 105 pounds, who are given a badge and a gun. You count on them to use their discretion so that they don't get hurt or so that they don't have to hurt someone else, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You count on that.
Yes, ma'am.
Regarding sanctions, the only sanction that you recall is the one I refreshed your recollection on, is that right? And it wasn't even a sanction.
Yes, ma'am.
It was just an incident, correct? But Mr. Slager has been investigated per your policy for 18 uses of force. Does that sound familiar? Situations in which he used force, not deadly force, but force.
I can't recall the number, but I know that there were some use of force incidents.
And 14 of those involved the taser. Does that sound familiar?
Again, I can't recall the exact number, but there were numerous of
Your
them.
experience as chief and as a part of those investigations, signing off on them and things of that nature, you would agree that 14 uses of taser in 6 years is a lot. In 4 years, I'm sorry, it's a lot.
So that number sounds high to me.
And you would agree that Officer Slager was not a shade tree officer. He wasn't hanging out being lazy under an oak tree.
No, ma'am.
He was very proactive, was he not?
Yes, ma'am, I would say that he is.
No questions.
Thank you. Let me step down.
Thank you, Judge.
Stand and stretch for a moment. See where we're going. All right. Staff, you ready with your next witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Ready to proceed?
Darren O'Shea.
You swear affirm the testimony you shall give the court and the jury in the trial of this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes, sir.
Excuse me, sir. There's a series of documents.
Please state your first and last name, and spell your last name loudly and clearly.
Dr. Darren K. Porcher. Last name is spelled Porcher. Good afternoon, sir.
Your voice sounds like you might be from New York.
Well, my relatives are from South Carolina. I have a lot of relatives that live in South Carolina.
The relatives in South Carolina have the same name as you?
Yes, sir.
And how do they pronounce it?
Porcher.
And you're from New York, and your name is?
People in New York are idiots. It's pronounced Porcher in New York, but it's Porcher originally.
And for purposes, you're in Charleston now, what would you prefer? We like Porcher.
I'm Porcher in Charleston.
So said doctor, so let's go through what your background is. Where were you raised?
I was born and raised in Bronx, New York.
And did you go to school in the Bronx?
Yes, sir.
And did you go to college after you finished your primary education?
Yes, sir.
And where did you go?
I have a bachelor's degree from St. Joseph's College, which is in the Bronx, which is in New York City. I have a master's degree or an MPA from Marist College, and I have a doctorate degree from Fordham University, which is in New York City.
And you currently teach at Pace College?
Well, sir, I'm a criminal justice professor at Pace University. I've been a criminal justice professor for over 10 years.
And at Fairleigh Dickinson University School of Criminal Justice?
I taught graduate studies at Fairleigh Dickinson University, which is in New Jersey.
And at Monroe College School of Criminal Justice?
I teach undergraduate students at Monroe College, which is in New York City.
And are you a commissioned officer in the military?
Yes, I'm a retired commissioned officer from the United States Army.
And are you retired from law enforcement?
Yes, sir.
Tell us what law enforcement agency you work for and for what period of time.
I was a lieutenant. I'm a retired lieutenant from the NYPD. I worked in the NYPD for a total of 20 years.
And what type of positions did you hold with the NYPD?
During my tenure in the NYPD from 1991 to 2011, I performed a multitude of various duties. Initially, I was a police officer in the South Bronx. Then I was a police officer working in the Civilian Complaint Review Bureau, where I investigated acts of police corruption, police misconduct, use of force complaints, things to that nature. I was then a detective in the Internal Affairs Bureau, where I investigated acts of police corruption. I was promoted to sergeant from the Internal Affairs Bureau, and I worked in the North Bronx as a patrol sergeant. Worked in the North Bronx for, I want to say, approximately a year. Then I was transferred to the New York City Police Academy as a sergeant. As a sergeant in the NYPD's Police Academy, I instructed thousands of recruits on police tactics and use of force for a period of 3 years. Upon completion of my tenure in the NYPD's Police Academy as an instructor, I was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. When promoted to the rank of lieutenant, I was transferred to Harlem, the Harlem area of New York City. I worked as what we refer to as a platoon commander, and that's basically a patrol lieutenant, so to speak. I worked in Harlem for a year, and then I was transferred to the New York City Department of Administrative Services, where I constructed promotional exams, which consisted of extracting policies, procedures, and policies for sergeants looking to get promoted to the rank of lieutenant. I worked at the Department of Personnel for a year doing examination construction, and then I was, upon completion of that, I was sent back to Harlem as a lieutenant. Working in Harlem as a lieutenant, I functioned as an integrity control officer. Basically, I was the quality control faction within the precinct that I was assigned to. I was subsequently transferred from Harlem to the Internal Affairs Bureau as a lieutenant. As a lieutenant in the Internal Affairs Bureau, I had a team of sergeants, detectives, and police officers that actively investigated police corruption and use of force allegations against police officers. I worked there for 3.5 years, and then I was transferred to the Community Affairs Bureau, where I functioned as the integrity control officer. Once again, it was basically a quality control faction within the police department. And that consumes the 20 years of experience that I have in the NYPD.
And before you entered the NYPD, you had your undergraduate degree?
No, I actually, through my tenure in the NYPD, I acquired my bachelor's degree, my MPA, which was my master's degree, and the majority of my doctoral studies were completed while I was a member in the NYPD. However, the dissertation component was completed after my retirement in the NYPD.
And your dissertation was on reducing school misdemeanor assaults in urban settings through leadership and police collaboration. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And throughout your teaching career, you have taught ethical issues in criminal justice, crime and public policy, criminal investigations, ethical issues in criminal investigations, contemporary issues in crime and justice, ethics, politics, and justice, analysis of serial killers, police in the community, criminology, and those field of studies.
Yes, sir.
And as in your profession and throughout your law enforcement career, did you make cases against police officers for policy and procedural violations?
Yes, sir.
And in that capacity, did you testify against police officers in departmental trials?
Yes, sir.
On how many occasions?
It's really difficult to make that assessment, but I've testified in many departmental trials for police officers that were in violation of department policy.
And, well, let me ask you, you have comp stats in New York?
Yes, sir.
And you were in the Bronx. Is the Bronx a comp stat area?
Unfortunately so.
And your familiarity then, based on your education, your training, your experience, what would you say your expertise is in with respect to use of force issues?
Well, working in the Internal Affairs Bureau for a period of 7 years, coupled with 2 years working in the Civilian Complaint Review Bureau, I feel that I have a strong knowledge and understanding of how to investigate these types of complaints. I worked there as a police officer, I worked there as a detective, and as a lieutenant. Therefore, quite frequently, I investigated, well, I had a team of, I investigated initially as a police officer and a detective, but as a manager, as a middle manager, as a lieutenant, I focused on the direction of how these investigations should take place.
And, Your Honor, we would present Dr. Porcher as an expert in the field of use of force and internal investigation.
We don't have any objection to his testimony regarding police tactics. I don't know if an internal investigation expert is relevant to this case.
Well, we'll just see as he testifies. I believe that he's well qualified based on his training and experience in matters involved in internal investigations of alleged police misconduct as a prosecutor to testify in that area.
Let me write these areas down again that you're often.
Use of force and police investigations of misconduct.
Police investigations of misconduct. What
Yes.
says the state?
Again, Your Honor, I don't believe a police investigation of misconduct is an issue in this case. As to use of force as it relates to police tactics based off his experience, we would agree with that. We would want to limit it to exclude any testimony as to the law, which would
All right, this stage we're talking about his qualifications as an expert. Do you wish to voir dire him? All right. I find that he is an expert in fields of use of force and police investigations of misconduct.
Dr. Porcher, are you involved in providing a national audience your opinion on police conduct cases?
Yes, sir.
And do you have a particular preference of who you'd like to testify or comment on behalf of police officers or citizens?
Well, I present commentary to a multitude of various media outlets.
And do you have a particular preference in testifying against a police officer or opinion against or for a police officer?
I don't have a particular preference. I basically call it as according to what I see.
And did you have occasion to be retained by the Savage Law Firm?
Yes, sir.
And was your retention for the purpose of analyzing policies, procedures, and conformity thereto by Officer Michael Slager?
Yes, sir.
And did you have occasion to come to Charleston to investigate those matters and to familiarize yourself with the documents pertinent to his career at North Charleston?
Yes, sir.
And were you advised of the location and the job which he was engaged in?
Yes, sir.
And were you advised of the CompStat sectors within North Charleston?
Yes, sir.
And were you familiar with the hours he worked and the type of employment challenges that he would have met in the areas and times in which he worked?
Yes, sir.
Did you have an opportunity to review his HR file, his history with the North Charleston Police Department?
Yes, sir.
And in that capacity, did you have an opportunity to investigate all reports of use of force by Officer Slager?
Yes, sir.
And do you have any reference notes with you, or are you able to testify about those from memory?
I have reference notes, but a lot of this is committed to memory, so I should be fine. So if you ask me a question, I need to refer to notes. I'll ask for permission, of course, and then I'll refer to notes. But for the most part, it's committed to memory.
The procedures here in South Carolina in the Court of General Sessions are, if you need to refresh your memory, you may look at your notes. If you're able to testify without refreshing your memory, whatever your needs are.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Now, did you receive Officer Slager's file of history with the North Charleston Police Department?
Yes, sir.
And did you find therein issues of use of force?
Yes, sir.
And were each and every one of those use of forces investigated by the North Charleston Police Department?
Yes, sir.
Did you ever find a situation in which he was sanctioned, challenged, reprimanded for any of his use of force?
No, sir.
Now, if you would take it one at a time through your analysis of Officer Slager's use of force.
Well, I conducted a quantitative assessment of Officer Slager's use of force over the 5-year tenure that he had within the North Charleston Police Department. In making that assessment, that 5-year assessment, I observed that there were 14 different occurrences where Police Officer Slager used a taser. Those 14 different occasions where a taser was utilized were deemed as proper within the parameters of his procedural guidelines. Basically, they were signed off or they were approved by a supervisory officer. Whenever there was a use of force that Officer Slager partook in, there was always a use of force report that was filled out by a superior officer, that being a sergeant. It went up the chain of command accordingly, and every single use of force that Officer Slager partook in was within department guidelines.
So you're referring to the findings of the department itself?
Yes, sir.
And in those occasions, was the taser deployed?
I have 14 occurrences where a taser was deployed.
And was the taser ever used without a deployment?
I have, outside of that, because I have 20 occurrences, I want to say I have 20 use of force occurrences. 14 evolved around a taser, and the other 6 were either empty hands, or there were two instances where a taser was presented but was not deployed.
And you familiar with the shift and the location where he was employed?
Yes, sir.
Did you find in any of those deployments of a taser that they followed a foot chase?
Yes, sir.
And tell us a little bit about, give us some taste of cop stories. Tell us about what he did on the street and why he, from the information you have, used tasers.
My critical assessment of Officer Slager's performance of duty within his 5-year tenure in connection with foot chases or whenever he engaged suspects appeared to be proper, and that's not just based on my perception, but the perception of superior officers. There were instances where there were foot chases, fights, etc., but Officer Slager always performed within department guidelines.
Well, in New York City, do the patrol officers, that's officers who had the same type of position as Officer Slager, do they have tasers?
Police officers in New York City do not carry tasers unless they're in the, what we refer to as the emergency service, the emergency service unit. That would be equivalent to a SWAT unit, so to speak, here. Supervisors carry tasers in the NYPD.
Did you have occasion to review reports of Officer Slager using his taser with people who are armed?
Yes, sir.
And can you give us a story or can you report to the jury about that occasion or those occasions?
One instance, Officer Slager stopped an individual. I want to refer to it as a car stop. That's where we have an individual that's in a car. Officer Slager confronted the individual. In the process of the car stop, I want to say information exchange between Officer Slager and the motorist. The motorist revealed that he was in possession of a firearm which was under the seat. That firearm was under the seat. Officer Slager requested the individual to exit the vehicle. He was a non-compliant individual. Officer Slager then, he drew his taser. And when I say drawing his taser, the taser was not used or deployed, so to speak. However, that gained compliance. So that was one particular instance where Officer Slager engaged an individual that was armed.
With the taser but not using the taser?
That's correct.
And tell us the situation with the foot chase in the middle of the night.
There were several foot chases, but whenever I observed Officer Slager involved in a foot chase and a taser was deployed or a taser was presented, there was never an instance where there was, I want to say, an abuse of force or the force went beyond the procedural guidelines that he was maintaining within the department. And that's when I revert back to every use of force report that was prepared by a supervisor in connection with Officer Slager was stated as being sound within the purview of department policies of the North Charleston Police Department.
Your independent review, I'm not speaking now of your review of what North Charleston did, but your independent review of his use of force, did you find that his use of force on any occasion was inappropriate? My
review had not revealed an instance where Officer Slager's use of force was inappropriate.
Did your review indicate that his use of force may have not been the proper use of force, that some other type of force would have been proper within the procedural guidelines of North Charleston?
As per my review and my independent opinion, I have never observed an instance based on those use of force reports that I reviewed to whereas I felt that the force was improper.
For his safety, that is Officer Slager's safety, was his use of force of the level sufficient, in your eyes, could he have used greater force on any of those occasions?
There have been instances whereas Officer Slager used less force than when I think in terms of what the force continuum is, the elevation, I want to say the escalation in force, whereas I personally may have used more force. And I give you the example of the car stop when the individual was in possession of a firearm and he was non-compliant. The firearm was under the seat of a car. There was another instance where Officer Slager approached someone that was in possession of a club and he used a taser. So those are two examples of where the force continuum would have allowed or suggested Officer Slager to use an additional amount of force. However, he chose to use the minimum amount of force necessary to effectively detain the individual.
There is a phenomena, I believe you told me about, called taser dependence. What does that mean?
When I think of taser dependence, I look at someone like Officer Slager, for example. 5 years in the police department, the utilization of a taser 14 times. That tells me that that's generally his first course of action when he's confronted with situations where the force continuum rises commensurate to the particular situation. So his first response was to go to the taser as it related to those two particular instances, the individual with the club, the individual with the firearm. But he was someone that consistently always saw a taser, and that was his mindset in addressing these particular instances. Now, keep in mind, using a taser on those particular instances, I have not seen an incident where I felt that it was used inappropriately.
Would your analysis say that he was dependent on the taser when he should have used a lethal weapon?
That is correct, and as I pointed out in those two particular instances.
And when you say use of a taser or use of a lethal weapon, that doesn't mean actuating those weapons, but presenting them.
That is correct.
When you initiated your testimony to this jury today, you said that you did a quantitative or a qualitative analysis.
Well, I actually conducted both. The quantitative is looking at the total number. The qualitative is actually looking at each and every report and making an assessment as to it being proper or improper.
And when you do a quantitative, the number of uses of force, what is that dependent on? Is that dependent on Officer Slager, or are there other factors involved?
My quantitative assessment in connection with Officer Slager's use of force was predicated on the use of force reports. And that's just the number of times that force was used.
And the qualitative would be the appropriateness of the force employed.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And what are the factors that one would judge another on the qualitative side?
The quality, when we look into a qualitative assessment, we look more into why was this force used? Was it appropriate? You know, what were the parameters of the force? That's the qualitative piece.
Is it fair to make a comparison of an officer who works in a low-crime area, or as a school resource officer, or as a desk person, or as somebody who isn't out on the street in the middle of the night? Is there a comparison between the two?
Between,
Quantitatively, number-wise, is it fair to compare an officer who's working in one sector as opposed to an officer who may be working as a school resource officer or somebody on administrative tasking or that sort of thing?
it's not a fair assessment, no.
And so the understanding of the appropriate use of force includes the circumstances in which the force is used. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
The size of the people involved, sobriety of the people involved, all the threats that can be observed at the time that the use of force is employed.
Yes, sir.
Did you find that all, if not all, of the uses of force by Officer Slager occurred in the presence of other officers?
Not all of the use of force occurred in the presence of other officers. A majority did occur in the presence of other officers and supervisors, I might add.
And is it your belief that the presence of other officers can diminish the type of force used?
Absolutely.
Great course indulgence, woman. Are there any occasions in your review of Officer Slager's history that you didn't follow the continuum force?
No, sir.
Are there any occasions in your review that you could have exceeded the use of force that you employed and still did within the law and the rules and regulations applied to the protocol?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to answer any questions that the prosecutor might have. Thank you, Dr. Burchett.
Thank you, sir.
Cross-examination.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon, how you doing? Sorry, I was getting the papers.
In the South, that they say that you're very hospitable, so I had to get the jump on you here.
Glad
So
you cleared up the Porsche thing, because I was going to call you that at least 3 times.
it's fine.
When were you retained by Mr. Savage, or Mr. Slade in this case?
I want to say approximately last year sometime. I can't give you an exact point, but it was sometime last year.
And you've testified today about reviewing the 14 taser incidents that were investigated by North Charleston's Internal Affairs Department, is that correct?
Yes, sir. Well, just for clarification, whenever there was a use of force, there was a report that was prepared. So in connection with the Internal Affairs Bureau, it's I don't want to say what the Internal Affairs Bureau did, but just the acceptance. I want to say the acceptance, but the approval of the supervisor that filled out the report.
So the 14 incidences during his 4 or 5 year career where he used a taser.
5-year career.
5 years, those were documented and you reviewed those?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, in that review, did you conduct any of your own independent investigation?
When you say an independent investigation, what do you mean?
Did you talk to any of the 14 people that got tased?
Did I do interview? Did I conduct interviews? No.
So you're essentially, your independent review of this is just taking North Charleston, whatever investigator or supervisor approved that use of force, you're just essentially following behind that saying, okay, there's a report, and they agree that it's okay, so I agree it's okay.
After supervisor said it was sound, I said, yeah, I would say yes.
And you would agree with me that any one of those 14 people who got tased may have a different opinion than what you came to?
That's a subjective question.
Fair enough. Now, did you review the shooting video in this case?
Did I review the shooting video?
Yes, the video where Mr. Slager is on video shooting.
Yes, sir.
You reviewed that?
Yes, sir.
Did you review the statements given by Mr. Slager to other North Charleston officers as well as to SLED agents?
Yes, sir.
Did you review the statements of the passenger in the vehicle, Mr. Pierre Full?
Yes, sir.
Did you watch the video of the traffic stop?
Yes, sir.
And did did you listen to the dispatch audio?
Yes, sir.
And did you listen to the audio from the body microphone?
Yes, sir.
And reviewing all those things, did you prepare a report as part of your expert testimony in that?
No, sir.
So you got all that up in your head.
Well,
I mean, if you do, it's impressive. I'm just
sir,
asking.
your question to me was, did I prepare a report? And my answer is no.
Well, my initial question was, did you review those things? And you were sort of hesitant, so I was just trying to make sure.
I apologize.
Because as Mr. Savage indicated, if you needed a refresher recollection, if you had a report, you could use that. But you
Yes,
don't
sir.
have none of those?
No, I've prepared I've prepared notes, but you asked me about a report.
So as part of your retention by the Savage Law Firm in this case, you weren't asked to compile all of these things that you reviewed and all of your findings into a concise, exact report that might help you and/or the jury understand what you did.
No, sir.
Okay. Now, you were asked about ComStat areas in South Bronx. Is a ComStat area?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Means it's a high crime area?
I want to introduce ComStat, and I just want to clear it up. ComStat is a computer program, and what that computer program does is it tracks crime statistics. In New York, we have something that's referred to as the 7 majors. However, the application in Charleston, North Charleston, is different. So it's not quote-unquote ComStat areas as you have here, because here in North Charleston, these are high crime areas. The whole city falls under the purview of ComStat in New York City.
Okay. So specifically to the Charleston Farm area, Charleston Farms area, we've heard about ComStat areas and statistics essentially.
Yes, sir.
And in a high crime area, I assume during your 20-plus year career, you work high crime areas.
Yes, sir.
And when you work a high crime area, you're still responsible for obeying the rules and policies and procedures of your department, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
Just because Officer A in a department may work in the suburbs where there's no crime and everybody loves the police and all that good stuff, Officer B, who works in a higher crime area or ComStat area, he still has to follow, they have to follow the same rules, correct?
Yes, sir.
Just because you're working in a high crime area, you don't get a free pass.
That's correct, sir.
It's not the Wild Wild West.
And in relation to your question, everyone has to follow the same procedures.
Okay. And we've had some testimony about backup officers and lack of backup officers. In your experience as a police officer, you don't always have backup, isn't that correct?
Backup is, do you not always have backup, is your question? You always have backup. The issue is the time that the backup shows.
Okay, but you won't always have backup readily available or at the scene when you initiate a call or when you respond to a call.
No, sir.
So there are times when you as a police officer, which is part of why it's such a dangerous and high risk and stressful situation, is you don't always have backup readily available, correct?
Backup, no, sir.
And once again, similar to working in a high crime versus a low crime area, just because you don't have a backup officer there doesn't mean you get a free pass.
No, sir.
It means you still have to follow the rules, the policies, and procedures, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, you mentioned what you call taser dependence, I believe was your terminology?
That was Mr. Savage's terminology.
Okay. But you testified about what taser dependence was. He asked you about taser dependence, and you testified about it, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I believe the testimony in response to Mr. Savage's question was that you found that Officer Slager's initial escalation in force was to use a taser.
In certain circumstances.
Those 14 incidences, you found that he went to a taser.
That is correct.
And you found that he went to a taser before he tried to employ any empty hand techniques.
That is correct. However, just to give you an explanation on that, the force continuum, just within the purview of the force continuum, it starts off with an officer's presence, verbal commands, the empty hand, and then the taser. You can walk straight into a situation and go straight to the taser if the situation dictates that.
Okay. But there are, according to policy, things available to an officer between presence and a level 4 taser, correct?
Well, once again, you mentioned within policy, if an officer assesses that this is a situation that requires a taser, they don't have to go to the force continuum of level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. They can go straight to the taser. And your question to me was the 14 occurrences where a taser was used. And what I'm telling, my answer to you is, in these instances, if an officer sees fit, they can walk directly into a situation at the level of using a taser. They don't have to progressively go through the force continuum.
If they see fit and the threat present for them,
Right, if it's commensurate with the threat, absolutely.
you don't get to just walk into a room and decide, all right, this is, I guess it's Tuesday, we're going to use a taser today instead of using empty hand tasers.
Your use of force is predicated on the incident that you have in front of you.
Well, let me ask you both, before we get to that, you would agree with me that officers, as part of their training, are trained in empty hand techniques,
Yes, sir.
which is essentially using your hands to control or manipulate a suspect.
Yes, sir.
And they're also trained in what are called takedowns,
Yes, sir.
pain compliance,
Yes, sir.
joint compliance,
Yes, sir.
escorts and escort positions.
Yes, sir.
Essentially all those things where you have to actually lay hands on somebody to gain control of them, correct?
Yes, sir.
And they're also, in North Charleston, they're given OC spray, which is essentially pepper.
Yes, sir.
Correct? All of those things would be on the force continuum below taser, correct?
Yes, sir. But you also have to take in consideration a taser at the time of the incident of last year was a level 3 that since increased.
But those things would all be options available to an officer before they went to a taser.
Yes, sir.
If
And
the
you
situation-
use the word options.
Okay. If the
It's not
situation-
absolute. It's an option.
I understand that. Well, let's talk about the incident in this case. You said you reviewed the videos and you reviewed the dispatch time as well as the body mic audio. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So in your review of these items, were you aware that Officer Slager, or the victim, or Mr. Scott, ran from the car at 9:36 and 8 seconds?
You said 9:36 and 8 seconds.
That's the time.
Oh, the time, yes,
Yes.
okay. I thought you meant 9 minutes and 30, okay.
And then 8 seconds later, you hear Officer Slager say taser. He mentions taser.
Yes, sir.
And then 9 seconds after that, which is, you hear him say taser, 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 correct?
Yes, sir.
Which means that's the warning before you tase somebody, correct?
Yes, sir.
So Officer Slager waited 17 seconds before he jumped straight to taser for a person who was solely running from him, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in North Charleston's policy, it says that you are not to use a taser simply because someone is fleeing or running away from you. Isn't that correct?
Sir, that's not a yes or no answer, and I'm going to answer it accordingly. Officer Slager pulled someone over, and there was a second person in the car. There's one person that's fleeing the scene, and there was a second person there. So the application of a taser was sound in that particular instance because Officer Slager was by himself.
Okay.
So it was more than just a fleeing suspect.
Okay. So you wouldn't categorize jumping from the suspect running to taser, taser, taser in that short a period of time as being taser dependent?
I wouldn't say that, I look at that situation as Officer Slager made an assessment, and based on his assessment, it was sound judgment. Because Officer Slager saw that there was a level of danger that was present. Remember, there was a second person in the auto. He felt that that was the most appropriate use of force in that particular instance.
So in your review of the policy of North Charleston, I'm going to show you what's in marks for identification. It states Exhibit 258.
Thank you, sir.
That's the policy you've had the opportunity to review.
Yes, sir.
And if I could direct your attention, page 7, and if I could ask
Sir,
you...
quick question. You want to put this up on the screen, that way the jury can see what I'm looking at?
Well, I'm going to have you read it to them so they can hear what you said.
I would prefer if you put it on the screen so they can see
It's
it.
not going into evidence, it's just for ID.
Okay, all right, that's fine.
Now, on their policy and procedure, under TASER procedures, could you read for me that part about fleeing being a reason to use a taser?
Okay, I just want to amplify. This is on page 7. This is subdivision E, and this is number 1, correct? Is that what you want me to read?
Yes, sir. The line that I-
Okay. It says, officers may use approved taser when they are required to use physical force for protection from assault and/or take a person into custody. An issued taser may be used when level 4 or higher resistance by a subject is encountered. Fleeing should not be the sole, I repeat, sole justification for the use of a taser on a subject. Officers should have a reason for detention or arrest. Taser use is permitted against animals.
A little earlier than what I wanted you to start, but you got the point that I wanted, which was the fleeing should not be the sole justification.
The sole justification.
Okay. So, in your opinion, after reviewing the video, reviewing the audio, and reviewing the policies of the North Charleston Police Department, it's your opinion that a suspect merely running from the vehicle because of the pulled over for a third tail light being out is justification for Officer Slager to initially jump straight to using the taser to tase that person?
You want me to answer? Okay, I'm sorry. And my answer to you, as I mentioned earlier, was Officer Slager was by himself. He's chasing one subject, and there's another subject in the auto. Officer Slager is by himself. Therefore, his assessment of the level of danger was commensurate with the usage of a taser. And I just want to go back to that policy that you showed me. It stated solely. In connection with running away, it specifically used the word solely. That we had, it was more comprehensive than just the individual running from the scene.
So your answer is, your opinion is yes, that was proven.
My opinion is yes, and the facts stated as well.
And as part of that answer that you gave, you testified earlier when I asked you that just because you don't have backup doesn't mean that you get a free pass, correct?
Just because you don't have backup, that doesn't mean you get a free pass. That's in connection with abiding by procedural guidelines, correct? You should always abide by procedural guidelines.
Okay. I think we agree on that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Porchett.
Thank you, sir.
Any redirect?
The reading you did for the jury about the use of a taser. When a person is stopped at a traffic stop, are they detained at that point? Is that considered a detention? Detained so that further investigation can be done, whether it's checking a driver's license or registration? But they're stopped by law enforcement.
Yes, sir. And I just want to be specific. The term stop means the person is not free to go. Is that correct as per your definition?
I'm asking you, because it says in this report that you read, in the policy, it's not necessary to have a reason to arrest somebody. It should be a reason to detain somebody. What is the difference between detaining and arresting a citizen?
The difference between detaining and arresting, when someone is arrested, that person is being brought into custody and brought into a police facility to partake in arrest processing. When someone is stopped, it can be merely to conduct an investigation, or the person is not free to go. The person is not free to go until the officer completes their investigation.
And in the continued use of force that the prosecutor was asking you about, from your observations of the video and listening to the audio, did Officer Slager start with level 1?
It did start with level 1, and, I'm sorry, yes, sir.
And then did it go to level 2?
Yes, sir.
And level 2 would be voice commands?
Yes, sir.
And level 2 would indicate by stop, or perhaps before that, get back in the car and there was compliance?
Yes, sir.
And when level 2, get back in the car, there was no use of a taser, there was no anything. The command was given, level 2, get back in the car, and the subject obeyed.
Yes, sir.
Call for no further action.
That was a level 2, like you mentioned.
And then when Mr. Scott ran, then it elevated, his behavior elevated to resistance in terms of the command. Stop. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So it elevated, by Mr. Scott, elevated the force continuum.
Yes, sir.
And when he was told, taser, 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 that's an instruction of forewarning, and I'm going to tase you if you don't stop.
Yes, sir.
And did he stop?
No, Mr. Scott did not stop.
And when there was a taser use that actually struck him with one prong, was there a compliance by Mr. Scott at that point?
No, sir.
And when there was a physical fight, a confrontation, an attempt by Officer Slager to subdue Mr. Scott by the use of hands-on, soft, whatever that...
Empty hand.
empty hand, the next level of force was there compliance.
No, sir.
Was there ever compliance
No, sir.
at all from the time he ran from the car that day? Did he ever put his hands up or make some sort of motion that he wanted to de-escalate the confrontation, or he wanted to surrender, or that he, even after the first shot was fired, was there any indication of compliance?
No, sir.
Kindly answer any additional questions the prosecutor might have.
Yes, sir.
That's perfect.
All right. Thank you. You may step down.
Okay, thank you. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
gentlemen, we've made it another day. One more day before Thanksgiving, or half a day before Thanksgiving. You need to come back at 9 tomorrow morning. Have a good evening. Well, let's stand for a moment and see what's what here. At 9:30 tomorrow morning. Have a good evening. 9:30. All right, we come to order. Anything else before we leave? From the state?
No, sir.
So we'll reconvene at 9. The jury's coming in at 9:30. And if you need to set something up, you need to do it before 9.
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll see y'all in a